Dimebag Darrell Abbott wasn't just another guitar virtuoso. He was a lightning rod for an entire generation of metal fans, hungry for fresh, punishing sounds. From his Texas roots under the guiding hand of his father, Jerry Abbott, to the worldwide stage with Pantera and later Damageplan, Darrell unleashed a style that fused the raw punch of thrash with the deep groove of Southern rock. His high-octane solos, melodic finesse, and laid-back charm spoke to fans who found both power and community in his music. But for all his larger-than-life presence, Dimebag remained approachable, happy to share a drink, a laugh, or a life-changing riff with those around him. That magnetic spirit made his untimely passing on December 8th, 2004, all the more devastating. To this day, his legacy, rooted in unstoppable determination, musical innovation, and genuine kindness, continues to influence new generations of guitarists and fans alike, ensuring that Dimebag Darrell's signature squeal rings on in the annals of metal history. On August 20th, 1966, Darrell Lance Abbott was born into this world, a boy destined to carve out a place in music history. Darrell, later known as Dimebag Darrell, didn't start life with the lightning-fast guitar chops we celebrate today, but he was surrounded by an extraordinary influence from day one. His father, Jerry Abbott, was a seasoned country music producer, a man who could spot talent and nurture it with a patient yet unyielding touch. Under that roof, sounds of twangy steel guitars melded with the persistent thump of a bass drum, creating an eclectic tapestry of country rhythms that would provide young Darrell and his older brother, Vincent Paul Abbott, Vinnie Paul, with a broad musical foundation. Over the years, that foundation would grow into an explosive style that would shake heavy metal fans to their core. Darrell and Vinnie were tight-knit, two peas in a pod. They shared more than just a last name. They shared a dream. While other teenagers were sneaking out to parties or racing cars down back roads, Darrell and Vinnie spent their days and countless nights jamming in the garage or their father's home studio. At first, Darrell tried out a handful of instruments, but when he wrapped his hands around the neck of a guitar, something about it clicked. There was a spark that flickered in his eyes, an unspoken sense that he'd found his life's calling. But it wasn't instant stardom or immediate excellence. In fact, Darrell was far from a child prodigy. He had that raw, unpolished grit that only yields results if you're willing to bleed for your passion, to put in those endless hours practicing chord shapes and riffs until you can hammer them out in your sleep. The Abbott brothers devoured influences like a hungry animal. They found themselves spinning records by Tony Iommi, Jimmy Page, and Eddie Van Halen, titans of rock and metal, whose fiery licks and unmatched showmanship lit a fuse in Darrell's mind. If Tony Iommi could conjure doom-laden riffs that sounded like a thunderstorm, then Darrell wanted to master that storm. If Eddie Van Halen could produce kaleidoscopic solos that seemed to defy logic, Darrell would practice until his fingers felt like they'd been through a meat grinder. This devotion manifested early, and by 14, Darrell was already entering guitar contests, competing against people twice his age. And the wild part? He kept winning. A kid barely in his teens was mopping the floor with older, more established players. Eventually, local contest organizers had to ask him to sit on the judges' panel instead of competing. He was that good. Vinnie, a talented drummer with a flair for thunderous beats, also found himself at a crossroads around 1981 when friends approached him about forming a band. He agreed on one condition: his kid brother had to be in. Reluctantly or otherwise, they said yes, probably not realizing just how crucial that decision would be to metal history. They cycled through a few band names before landing on Pantera, a name that would soon ring out in headbanger circles nationwide. Early Pantera was a different beast than the force of nature it would later become. At that time, glam metal ruled the airwaves. Bands like Mötley Crüe and Poison wore mascara, teased their hair into towering sculptures, and delivered flashy guitar solos over pop-infused metal. Pantera, featuring Darrell, then known as Diamond Darrell, and a rotating cast of singers and other guitarists, wanted a piece of that action. They dove headfirst into the glam scene, releasing Metal Magic, 1983, and Projects in the Jungle, 1984, on their father Jerry Abbott's label. Neither album shook the ground. Critics barely raised an eyebrow. Fans of heavier music barely noticed. But behind that big hair and spandex, change was brewing. Somewhere in the swirl of glossy magazine covers and stage makeup, Darrell and Vinnie felt an itch. They loved the grit of heavier rock, the menacing groove of Sabbath, the speed of thrash. They sensed that glam metal, fun as it was, might only be a stepping stone to something that resonated deeper in their musical souls. Then came Metallica's Ride the Lightning in 1984, a revelation that altered Pantera's musical DNA. Suddenly, a universe of thrash metal, faster riffs, darker themes, no frills, opened up to them. Darrell and Vinnie soaked it all in, deciding that their future wasn't in pandering to the pastel glam crowd, but in forging a heavier, groove-laden sound, combining thrash aggression with the soulful grit of 70s rock. Their next album, I Am the Night, 1985, hinted at this heavier direction. However, not everyone in the band was on board. Terry Glaze, the vocalist at the time, still wanted to ride the glam train, resisting the Abbott brothers' push toward a more brutal style. Creative differences boiled over, and Glaze eventually exited the band. Pantera soon discovered a brash 18-year-old vocalist named Phil Anselmo. Phil possessed a commanding stage presence, a growl that could shake the rafters, and a willingness to experiment with heavier sounds. It was a match made in headbanger heaven. Phil joined, and Pantera knocked out Power Metal, 1988. That record still had traces of glam, but the band was obviously evolving. The riffs hit harder, the solos had more bite, and the overall vibe was one of imminent transformation. Darrell, now leaning fully into the name Dimebag Darrell, was coming into his own as a formidable guitar presence. The spandex and moose finally got tossed out. It was time to unleash the raw, unpolished aggression they'd been stoking. In the late 80s, Jerry Abbott realized that Pantera needed a new manager, someone less tied to the old-school country scene and more in tune with the modern metal wave. Walter O'Brien stepped in. After a slew of rejections, Pantera finally struck a deal with Atco Records. The band enlisted producer Terry Date to record what many fans and critics consider Pantera's true debut, Cowboys from Hell, 1990. If you compared that album to the first few Pantera records, you'd hardly recognize it as the same band. Overnight, they morphed into a heavier, more focused unit. Dimebag's riffs carved out a middle ground between thrash's speed and 70s rock's southern fried soul. It was both melodic and punishing, a sound that would later be called groove metal. The release of Cowboys from Hell launched Pantera onto a larger stage. Suddenly, the band that once struggled to get noticed was now touring with major acts, playing to packed houses, head-banging in unison with frenzied crowds. Dimebag's presence was electric. Live, he'd tear into solos with a grin that seemed permanently plastered on his face, his Dean guitar slung low, the whammy bar squealing like a demon unleashed. Yet, for all the furious energy he brought on stage, off stage, he was known for being downright friendly. Fans would approach him for an autograph or a photo, and he'd oblige with the excitement of a kid meeting his own heroes. With growing momentum, Pantera rolled out Vulgar Display of Power in 1992, An album title that boldly promised brutality and delivered on every track. The production was tighter, the riffs chuggier, and Phil's vocals toggled between raw growls and cutting shrieks. Dimebag's solos, meanwhile, soared in ways that were both technical and deeply emotional. You could feel the southern warmth underlying the metallic carnage. And fans responded in kind, pushing the album up the charts. By the time Far Beyond Driven hit in 1994, Pantera was riding a wave of critical and commercial success that few metal bands could touch. They were unstoppable, and the metal world took notice. But life on the road, especially at the intensity Pantera demanded, took its toll. Night after night of partying, performing, traveling, repeat. Dimebag was legendary for his partying. The Blacktooth Grin, his infamous cocktail of whiskey, Crown Royal or Seagram 7 with just a splash of Coke, became as much a Pantera signature as the band's punishing riffs. There were stories of epic booze-fueled nights with Dimebag as the ringmaster of a traveling rock and roll circus. Yet, behind the wild times, the band maintained a strong internal bond, at least for a while. Around 1995, cracks started to form. Rumors circulated that Phil Anselmo had begun to distance himself from the group, no longer as engaged in the brotherly camaraderie that once fueled the band. Unbeknownst to many, Phil had a chronic back injury sustained from years of intense, high-energy performances. Doctors advised surgery, but he feared the lengthy recovery would stall the band's momentum. Instead, he self-medicated with potent painkillers and eventually heroin. This created a growing gulf within Pantera. Tensions mounted, especially after Phil overdosed in 1996, his heart stopping for minutes before he was revived. The near-death experience shocked fans and bandmates alike. For Darrell and Vinny, discovering Phil's heroin habit felt like a betrayal, a hidden demon haunting their once unified team. Adding to the strain, Phil's stage banter sometimes veered into provocative or controversial territory, which clashed with the Abbott brothers' preference to let the music speak for itself. As the years passed, Pantera's output slowed. Phil pursued side projects, notably Down and Superjoint Ritual, investing more and more time into those ventures. During the recording of The Great Southern Trendkill, 1996, Phil even laid down his vocals in a separate studio from the rest of the band. Reinventing the Steel followed in 2000, but by then, the unity was fractured. They went on tour for the album, culminating in their last official show in Yokohama, Japan, on August 28, 2001. A few weeks later, the world changed with the September 11th attacks. The band decided to take a breather, though there's debate about who initiated it. According to Vinny, it was Phil who suggested the break, yet Phil later claimed it was a mutual agreement. Regardless, the hiatus never truly ended because Phil dove back into side projects while the Abbott brothers waited, hoping for the band to reconvene. That didn't happen. By 2003, Pantera was over. It wasn't a graceful farewell, it was more of a slow, painful unraveling like a cable fraying until it snapped. For Dimebag, the breakup was a gut punch. Pantera was his life's work, a 20-plus year investment of sweat, soul, and creativity. The ensuing public fallout with Phil Anselmo turned nasty, with media interviews capturing bitter remarks from both sides. Dimebag and Vinny considered continuing Pantera with a different vocalist, but decided that the legal and emotional entanglements would be too much. Instead, they birthed a new beast, Damageplan. Joined by vocalist Patrick Lockman and bassist Bob Zilla Kakaha, they hoped to recapture some of that onstage magic without the baggage that had weighed Pantera down. Damageplan's debut, Newfound Power, 2004, offered a chunk of heavy riffs and guest spots, by notable rockers. Despite the star power, reviews were lukewarm and sales never soared. But Dimebag and Vinny were relieved to be making music again, even if it meant playing smaller venues. For Dimebag especially, the energy of a live audience was a life force. The tighter, more intimate club circuit brought him closer to fans, many of whom idolized him for his Pantera glory days. He'd happily chat with them after shows, share a drink, snap photos, and generally embody that down-home Texan charm. Then came December 8th, 2004. It was a cold, unremarkable night at the Alrosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio, the sort of place that hosts traveling metal acts looking to keep the fire alive. Damageplan took the stage, and for a brief moment the world was as it should be. Loud guitars, pounding drums, a crowd cheering for Dimebag's next crushing solo. But a lone figure in the crowd, a deeply disturbed fan named Nathan Gale, had other plans. Fueled by delusions that Pantera had stolen his lyrics and identity, Gale rushed the stage, opening fire. Dimebag collapsed immediately, struck down at the age of 38. In the chaos, 3 more people lost their lives before the police shot and killed Gale. The entire incident lasted mere minutes, but it left a scar that the metal community still bears. In the immediate aftermath, rumors swirled, as they always do in such tragedies. Some whispered that Gale shouted about Pantera's breakup before pulling the trigger, fueling speculation that he blamed Dimebag for the band's demise. Others pointed to a disturbing interview from Phil Anselmo just weeks prior, in which he stated Dimebag needed to be beaten severely. Emotions ran hot. Vinnie Paul and many of Dimebag's inner circle harbored resentment toward Phil, believing his words might have played a role, even if indirectly. Official investigations, however, determined that Gale's motive was purely tied to his paranoid delusions about stolen lyrics. No direct link to the band's breakup or any interpersonal drama. The shock of losing Dimebag Darrell reverberated through the metal world like a seismic event. Candlelight vigils, memorial concerts, and endless tributes poured in. One of the most poignant tributes came from Eddie Van Halen, Dimebag's longtime hero and a major influence on his style. Eddie placed his iconic black and yellow striped guitar in Dimebag's casket, a final, touching farewell from one legend to another. It was a symbolic passing of the torch, though it also felt like the extinguishing of a bright flame. In the years since his passing, Dimebag has become an icon, immortalized as a guitarist who merged technique with heart, who played for the joy of it, who welcomed fans as friends, and turned up the volume on every stage he graced. His body of work, particularly those landmark Pantera records, continues to energize and inspire new generations of metal enthusiasts. Young guitarists still scour Dimebag's solos for clues on how he conjured those dive bombs, squeals, and lightning runs. But more than the notes he played, it's the spirit he embodied that resonates. He was an ambassador for fun, for camaraderie, for the idea that metal can be both brutal and welcoming. As the dust settled after the tragedy, the remaining members, friends, and family grappled with the aftermath in different ways. Vinnie Paul, forever marked by the loss of his beloved brother, pursued other musical endeavors and carried the torch in memory of the good times they shared. Some fans clung to Pantera's classic albums as a sacred testament to what the band achieved, lamenting the unresolved tensions that tore them apart. Others discovered Damageplan's short-lived run and wished they'd had more time to explore that chapter. But in the end, nearly everyone agreed on one thing. Dimebag Darrell was a force of nature, an artist who wore his heart on his fretboard, giving everything he had right up until his final moments on stage. That final show, that final note, it's almost poetic. One moment, Dimebag was doing what he loved most, completely in his element, riffing and soloing for a crowd that adored him. The next, he was gone. The fragility of it all shook the entire rock and metal community, reminding everyone that behind the larger-than-life personas, behind the monstrous amps and pyrotechnics, these musicians are flesh and blood, vulnerable, mortal, and subject to the random cruelty of fate. Looking back at his journey, it's impossible not to be awed by the sheer willpower and dedication that propelled Dimebag from a kid in Ennis, Texas, to a stage-dominating legend. He was once a boy who banged out awkward chords on a cheap guitar, fascinated by the sounds blasting from his dad's studio. He became a man whose solos roared with a primal energy, who made thousands of aspiring musicians believe they, too, could capture lightning in a bottle if they practiced hard enough and put their soul into every note. His grin on stage was more than a show of confidence. It was an invitation for all of us to join in the celebration of music's raw power. For many fans, Pantera represents a golden era of metal, an age when a band from Texas could redefine heaviness by melding thrash speed, southern rock grooves, and a no-nonsense attitude. Their albums remain benchmarks, but they're also time capsules. Listen closely, and you'll hear the bond between two brothers, the unstoppable force of their ambition, and the family ties that gave them the courage to experiment beyond the glam confines of their earliest days. Dimebag's guitar squeals on Cowboys from Hell, or his soaring leads on Cemetery Gates, evoke a timeless sense of awe. Each note is drenched in sweat and sincerity. When the story of Pantera ended, it didn't unravel in a neat bow. Bitterness, misunderstanding, and personal demons overshadowed the final chapters, yet the music transcends those human failings. There's a reason new fans still discover Pantera and find themselves enthralled by the aggression and groove. These songs channel a visceral energy that remains undiminished. Dimebag was the conduit, channeling decades of influences, personal struggles, and brotherly chemistry into something that felt larger than life. Even in his final year, when Damageplan was hustling across the country in a bus far smaller than what Pantera had commanded at their peak, Dimebag seemed to relish the opportunity to be up close with fans. That sense of connection was central to his being. If there was any consistent thread from his earliest contest victories to his last performance, it was the pure joy of sharing music with people. He was never too jaded or too famous to crack a smile and say thanks. There was a youthful exuberance in him that stardom didn't kill, that success didn't taint, and that heartbreak couldn't extinguish. The tragedy that befell him on December 8, 2004, was more than a senseless act of violence. It was a theft of a vibrant spirit whose generosity of talent and heart seemed limitless. It left fans reeling with questions that can never be fully answered. What if Damageplan had evolved further? What if Pantera had reconciled, at least for a reunion tour, reuniting Dimebag's riffs with Phil's guttural vocals, and maybe even bridging the personal divides that had grown so wide? Those what-ifs remain a haunting chord in the story, an unfinished passage in a composition that ended abruptly. Still, legacies are often defined as much by how someone lived as by how they died, and Dimebag lived to play guitar. He was the kind of musician who made everyone around him feel the electricity. Ask any fan who stood in front of the stage at a Pantera show, feeling the vibrations of Vinny's drums in their chest while Dimebag's furious riffs tore through the air. Ask any guitarist who tried to learn one of his solos note for note, only to realize how much of his technique was in the subtle bending of strings, the intangible flair that can't be taught, only felt. In those intangible qualities lies the essence of Dimebag Darrell. He was more than a sum of influences, more than a discography or a tone. He was passion incarnate, bottled up in a human form, unleashed through an amplifier turned up to 11. And despite the darkness that eventually claimed him, the light he cast endures. From basement jam sessions to sold-out stadiums, from glam beginnings to groove metal dominance, from heartbreak to tragedy, his story is a testament to the power of following your bliss with unwavering commitment.